After working several search and rescue missions, I can tell you some pretty crazy horror stories about some of my own terrors that I've witnessed. Myself, along with 2 other friends, were out searching for a lost hiker. We got a call from dispatch saying they finally found him, although now he was deceased. We began heading back to the station when our boss gave us yet another call, claiming there was an emergency on the mountain about 3 miles west of us. So, me and my buddies hopped on an all-terrain vehicle, also known as ATVs for you uneducated. We sped over there as quick as possible. When we had arrived, the scene was unlike anything I've ever seen. We found the 2 men dead. They looked like they were in their mid-30s, both of them completely drained of all their blood. There was no blood anywhere to be found, not even the slightest spatter. The bodies lay there with gaping wounds they had clearly bled out from. Not only was all their blood gone, but all their fluids as well. They had become nearly dried up husks of what they were. There were no trace of any bodily fluids on the ground, or by their body. There was no blood marks or anything on their bodies, and they looked rather recently deceased. Within the last 12 hours, it was determined. After noticing puncture wounds on their necks, it became clear that these men were killed by some sort of wannabe vampires or potentially a vampire cult. Of course, this sounds crazy, and after doing some more research, I realized there have been a string of murders within the same MO all around the world. In every single case, victims had been murdered in cold blood, completely drained of all their fluids. Obviously, this also goes hand in hand with many alien abductions, as well as cattle mutilations. This is not just some quinky-dink either. They always happen near a large body of water, or in the deep woods. Most people, or in this case, these victims, will go missing at night, and they come back during the day. We really might as well be dealing with a vampire cult here, who could potentially be extremely dangerous. None of us could really believe what we were dealing with. The sheer absurdity from it is what made it scary. One of my close friends suggested we do some more research, so I tried to do some more digging and learned a bit about vampirism in detail. And after doing some more reading on the mythology, this is when I realized there are many cults mimicking the way a vampire would kill. However, the manner in which these gentlemen were killed still doesn't make a whole lot of sense. The lack of blood anywhere had baffled me. I wasn't really sure what to make of all of it, if we're honest. After forensics had a pretty deep look, I found out that both gentlemen were killed around the same time, within 10 minutes of each other. Another thing that I found interesting is that these guys both knew each other. They were lovers, apparently. I have a hard time believing that these 2 awkward-looking gentlemen would have been a part of any cult. However, it's possible they could have been the victims of a random cult killing, possibly a satanic ritual or sacrifice. Another run we had was in the Colorado wilderness. An older woman had become lost and was missing for 2 days total. We searched easily 10 miles from the direction she was last seen. We found nothing. We called off the search, heading back. During our trip, we came across a small tent in the middle of nowhere. A bunch of food, drinks and water and supplies. We thought it was strange to see a tent with nobody in sight, only to find the campsite abandoned. It was inconclusive if there was ever any evidence to her living or staying in it for any amount of time. Fast forward about 5 months after, it's now early fall, about 20 plus miles away from where she had been last seen on that cool March afternoon. Half of her skull was found, her right hiking boot, and a torn piece of backpack with small snippets of blood on it. After testing the DNA, it appeared the skull fragment, blood, and the shoe all belonged to the same older woman. They were all found within about a 60-foot radius of each other in a small meadow near a larger creek. The rest of her remains were never found. The lack of reasonable explanation for these cases is what really baffles me. We had found the woman's skull, her shoe, and a piece of her backpack near a creek, but have no way to tell how it got there, We had searched the area where she was last seen for days and found nothing. It's hard to believe that she could have gotten there on foot. Maybe they were all abducted or something. Might be plausible, but I still find it strange that we never found a clue as to what happened. We had consulted with professionals. They agreed that not only is this simply unexplainable, but also considerably disturbing. They could not believe their luck, however. They too came up short in providing us with ample answers or solutions. We took a heavy break from the case, as it weighed heavy on our minds and spirits. But it didn't stop here. We had a middle-aged gentleman, Michael Yurvow, go missing under mysterious circumstances. Around noon, his wife had saw him leave to go use the restroom, but never returned. Michael Yurvow, 59, disappeared around noon on September 11th. He went to use the restroom and never came back. After extensive searching, nothing was found. However, 2 weeks later, all of his clothes that he was wearing on the day of his disappearance were found in a pile, as if he had somehow stripped. They were completely clean. Having been missing for 2 days, and having not any speck of dirt or being tattered in any way is unexplainable as well. About a month after, roughly 25 days, 7 miles away from where he was last seen, 4 miles from the highway, and 3 away from what seems like a running path, his remains were discovered. As much as I wanted to find him alive, I knew that's not what we would find. We called it off as soon as we saw him laying lifeless on the ground, next to an old oak tree. The cause of death was asphyxiation. The man had been hung by a rope that was wrapped around his neck. He also had deep cuts on his wrist. There were no other signs of any damage that had occurred to his body. We found him in such a state that we knew he had been dead for at least a week. He was also wearing white robes when we found him, and the rope that was used to hang him was also gone. The entire circumstances in which finding his body was very, very strange. Anyhow, if I get more time, I'll gladly share some more stories. For now, I'm sorry that this is all you're getting. I will follow up with you soon. Thank you. While not exactly a park ranger, I've been working alongside the Forest Service industry now for years. I wanted to come forward with my own stories to share with you. A few years back, I was working closely with a team in the deep woods of eastern Oregon. We had been working for days and nights on end, clearing overgrown trails and keeping them maintained for loggers and hikers alike. And this is when we began experiencing strange things that we've never would have expected. While we were clearing one trail, we saw something large running through the forest towards us in our direction. It was large, moving unusually fast. Considering how dense the brush was, it should have been impossible. At first, I thought it to be a bear, but its gait wasn't right for any animal that I knew. Much more like a man, but moving far too quickly to be one. It did not take long before everybody started calling it Old Three Toes, because of the way its heel protruded from its foot. That's not something you can fake. My team began telling everybody who worked for our company that Old Three Toes was out there somewhere. Well, the next morning, while we're all eating breakfast, somebody noticed some strange tracks in the mud alongside one of our trails. All of us gathered around to examine them. They had 3 toes, with unusually long nails and claw marks unlike any animal I'd ever seen. I'm no tracker, but I know enough about animals to say that this wasn't an animal print. It had been indeed made by a man. We had heard stories for years about how people had lost their dogs upon these forest roads. Something would chase them until they could not run anymore and take them. At first, we had a hard time believing all this, but something was out there. We just knew it. It walked through the forest like a man, but operated and functioned like an animal. Now, I've shared this story multiple times. Even though we've only saw it once, I hope it had not seen us. I share this story to try and bring some attention to people about the things that go bump in the woods. Sometimes, it's said that you can hear his long nails scraping against the tree trunks at night. In fact, one of my close friends, who's worked as a ranger for 12 years, told me about his own personal experience, where he explained something very similar to what I just told you. It was about 3 years ago now. I was out on my own, patrolling one of the trails. As I'm walking down this empty path, I could hear something very large approaching. I first spotted Old Three Toes as I walked down the trail. I thought it was a bear, but its stride wasn't right, and it had only 3 toes on its feet that I could see. Feet that looked similar to like a large ostrich. When we heard the strange prints, we had gathered around to examine them. They had 3 long, oddly shaped toes with very long claws. It looked like they had been clawing something recently, as there were deep gouges in the earth. None of us knew what it was, but at the least, there was something large stalking us through those woods. I can't even go now without hearing the sounds of it. The scariest part is that I know it's there, waiting for somebody to make a mistake, and surely it'll snatch up somebody. Now, I don't think it's a Bigfoot. I've never seen any evidence of these things' presence. But Old Three Toes, that's a different story. I know it's around. I've heard the nails clicking on tree bark before, as it gets close. While I've only seen it once, I'm very aware that it's out there, waiting for the right moment to show itself. I think that people should be very aware of these things' existence. You may have seen something similar in legends or campfire stories, but I assure you, after experiencing what we did, nothing will be all the more terrifying. Search and rescue is a very important piece of the emergency management puzzle. It's oftentimes much overlooked, but it is a very thorough, integral part of the entire process. One thing that search and rescue offers that other components don't is humans first. A little bit of background on me. I'm a self-professed paranormal junkie. I've got a library of bookshelves of manila folders, bursting with handouts and hauntings, Bigfoots, UFOs, cryptids, everything you could need. And long story short, I also worked as a ranger a long time ago, back in the late 80s and early 90s. For this presentation, I dug up several bits of info of search and rescue missions that I had personally worked on. The first is this woman, Kaylee Copley, whose real name will remain withheld. She was a 26-year-old woman who was visiting Hot Springs National Park. The last time her family saw her was when they visited the national park on August 15th. Her family had reported her missing that same day. She was last seen at approximately 4:30 p.m. on the 15th at their remote campsite. Her car was also found near the site, but she was nowhere to be found. After extensive searching, her body was located eventually 28 miles away from the campsite on a lone remote road. The search for Kaylee was massive, involving hundreds of volunteers from every walk of life imaginable. The search party covered a 15-mile radius from the campsite on foot and horseback, while aerial searches were conducted by fixed-wing aircraft and helicopters. The searches that were also cross-referenced with Hot Springs PD records of registered sex offenders, all of whom who live within a 15-mile radius of the park. They too were all unsuccessful. The party was certain that Kaylee was not found in the park itself, as they had been checking every inch. Now, a pair of hunters, during their annual trip to the national forest, discovered her remains. Kaylee's body had been with her right arm missing, and most of her vital organs missing. Her body, for the most part, was completely untouched by nature, other than a few things, which I'll get to. At the time of finding, she had been dead for roughly 48 to 72 hours. The search party and everybody involved was very perplexed. They had gone over every inch of the park, finding no evidence whatsoever. Yet, here's Kaylee's body, dumped in an area that seemed purposefully left untouched by nature. Which only leads us to one thing: she had to have been abducted. There's no way somebody could have casually kidnapped her and then dumped her body all this time later without ever knowing. But it's not all that simple. Another peculiar piece of evidence is that her body was untouched by wildlife. Even though she had been dead for at least 48 hours, her body should have been at least touched by a predator, scavenger, or other animal. There were no signs of flies or any decay settling in. The damage to her body may have possibly been a result of ritualistic killing. There are indications that she might have been the victim of a satanic ritual, that her organs were harvested after she was dead. Significant amounts of damage had been done to Kaylee's body, which would have already been done after she was dead. But the damage was primarily on her lower back and rectum. Severe bruising and swelling, indicating a fall landing on her backside. However, none of that explains her vital organs missing, as there were no incision marks anywhere on her body. The death of this woman is very mysterious. It's unclear why her organs were removed, and or how they were removed without ever having cutting her open. There are many questions that cannot be answered. There's not near enough evidence to give an answer, as many questions have been raised. All we have is a body, and no way to tell how, who, what, when, or where. Another young man, Dennis Howe, also not his real name. Dennis, also 19 years old, was out on a hunting trip in the Ohio River Valley when he had first disappeared. He had ventured out Friday to go hunting, but never returned home. His last known location was in southern Indiana, and a search party with Dennis's family found his car in the parking lot Friday at 8 p.m. after they searched thoroughly all throughout Friday. His hunting supplies were still inside the car, but nobody ever saw Dennis. There was no trace of him anywhere near his vehicle, at all, or near the property. The search party discovered this strange thing about Dennis's disappearance. There were no signs of foul play at all, which was odd. It would be unlikely that somebody who knew how to hunt would properly leave their equipment behind, vanishing without a trace. After all, even though Dennis was only 19, he was very well versed in the outdoors, according to his family. A large search party of at least 50 people was scouring the entire adjacent area. Nobody can find traces of him. The only theory we have is he was possibly abducted, although no signs of kidnapping were left. A search party also discovered something else strange about the location. There is no indication that Dennis ever entered the forest. Even though his car was found and the trailhead to go into the forest was clear, there should have been marks from his tires, footprints, since much of the mud around his vehicle was very wet that day. It appeared he had not even got out of his vehicle. He could have gone a few hundred feet into the woods, but there's no evidence of it. There's not any evidence that he had left his car. The only thing we know is that he had vanished without a trace over the weekend. No signs of foul play, and there's no way he could have entered without leaving evidence. About a year later, a molar and 6 teeth were found. It was discovered that the teeth were actually linked to Dennis, and they did belong to 19-year-old Dennis. The teeth had been another result of an extensive search. They were found in the woods, deep, about 2 miles away from where Dennis's car was. Nobody knows how or why his teeth were the only thing that showed up, and why they showed up. It's hard to know how or why Dennis completely vanished without a trace. His body was never recovered, and the only remains found were his teeth, which were found about 2 miles away. Still, we don't know how or why they ended up in the location they did, and it's a mystery. While dark things do happen, we're not exactly sure what is causing the multitude of paranormal-like disappearances for these young people, and it remains a large mystery to this day. Not my own story, but I would like to tell you about a family member who had worked as a ranger for years. They very much believe in Bigfoot, and have had their own experiences while working in the national parks from Minnesota, all the way up north to New York. Here are his experiences, which he had the pleasure of typing up and sending to me. I once had an amazing experience while working in the forest ranger office of a national park in Minnesota. I was there for a couple of days, and it was late at night. We were out doing our rounds as usual, and we saw some lights up on the hill near the lookout tower. At first, they looked like they might be a large deer, possibly. However, after looking again, we could see that it was indeed two large eyes, like we had suspected, but they were larger than what we had originally thought. They were almost glowing an orange-red, no pupils or whites to them. We had all alerted each other and went to investigate the area more closely. We did not see any other movement or anything else outside the eyes. Upon further inspection, we also realized that the eyes were not in the direction of the tower. Instead, seemed to be in a direct line with us. As we drove closer, these eyes turned toward us, running into a clearing that was a little bit more open. And this was when we saw it for the first time. A massive creature, standing about 9 to 10 feet tall, a large frame built like a house, leaning down kind of hunched over, as if it had scoliosis. We described it as almost gorilla-looking, especially with the proportion of legs, but far more muscular than an average human. It also had very long hair covering most of its body, including the face. The only part we could clearly see were its glowing red eyes. We all took a step back, deciding to leave quickly. This thing moved very swiftly, and just as we did, it ran away from us. Once we left, and there was safe enough distance, we radioed our station back to let them know what was going on. The next day, we decided to visit the same area and see that there were no trails coming off or from the road. There was no evidence of any activity during the night. The ground around the area in which we saw it was very soft. Surely, there would have been a track or two. But after scouting for about 2.5 hours, we found nothing. The second time was when I was up in New York State, working at Letchworth State Park. While I was on duty, I saw something large following me in the trees. It reminded me of a very large hairy man. Immediately, it became very dark, and I began to feel as if somebody was watching me, as well as my partner. We had both become incredibly nervous. We now left our post and started heading back to the vehicle. Unfortunately, I had left my flashlight with my partner so he could get ahead of me in finding our way back. As soon as we began making our way, I heard a small noise and turned. I couldn't see anything, but felt this immense pressure in my gut, like something was about to happen. Right after, I heard my partner shout and then start running towards me. It didn't take long for him to get to me. We began running towards the car. We didn't look back, and we could hear branches breaking in the woods, telling us that whatever this was something not a human. It was pissed and was now chasing us. We made our way back to the car, and we were able to get in and leave. It seemed like it took hours, but at most, from the time we exited our vehicle to going down the trail to encountering it and going back, was at most 10 minutes. That was by far the most intense experience I had while working. But I also have a story to share with you from a friend who was working in the Adirondacks. The incident took place on a trail that is fairly remote. Not too many people go out on it. He was working alone, and he approached a bend in the trail. He noticed something large standing right next to the trail itself. He wasn't sure what it was at first, but as he got closer and made his way around the bend, he saw that there was a very large figure hunched over on the trail itself. From behind, he described it as large, tall, and almost gorilla-looking in nature, until it turned around, and he realized the face was far more human than he had ever imagined. The nose and bridge were very much like a man, with a very strong brow ridge and a pointed head. He told me that it reminded him of the movie Coneheads, that same shape but not as exaggerated of a cone shape. It also had no neck, and was built like Arnold Schwarzenegger in his prime in the 1980s. It gave him a very stern look, and its eyes were black. The feeling he got was that he was not supposed to see it. He quickly turned back the way he came, going back to his station where he waited for another ranger to show back up. I have asked several people who work in these parks about these things, and they all have at least one experience with these creatures. We're kind of not allowed to talk about it. It seems as though these creatures are not usually aggressive, but at times they can be, while other times they almost appear curious and interested in humans. Okay, my personal last encounter for now. Fast forward. This was in 1999, the last time I'd encountered one of these creatures. I was working in one of the parks. This was also just outside of Yosemite. I was not alone. There were 2 other rangers with me, and we had all seen them before. The first time they had showed themselves to us, and it was at nighttime. They seemed to be interested in our activity. The ranger who had dealt with them previously described them as very territorial and aggressive, and resembled your stereotypical Bigfoots. At this point, I had already had the previous 2 other encounters, so I wasn't really wanting to share that information, just in case I was crazy, or they thought I was crazy. They appeared to be outside and waiting for us to make a move. The second time was during the day when we were out on patrol. They appeared to come out of nowhere, but seemed like they were very tactical, staying hidden behind the trees, waiting for us to show ourselves. We're not sure what they were planning, but they never made their move. We think they are very intelligent, but felt that maybe, for them, they were planning to attack, but the situation wasn't right. Just my thoughts, of course. The Martin family had downsized their lives. A workplace injury had devastated Eric, and Shelley had left her job to take care of her husband. As a result, they were looking for a less expensive place to live. Shelley had found a beautiful older farm right in Palmyra. It was just what they needed. It was also surrounded by dense, thick woods. Eric's family had always been full of hunters, and his fairly extensive collection of guns was a bone contention with Shelley. With the help of Eric's son, Sean, Eric had built a strong box to hold the guns under lock and key in the barn. Eric and Shelley had a routine of evening coffee on the sheltered porch, provided it wasn't too cold out. One night, they noticed strange, pulsating lights down past the tree line. At first, Sean thought it was just a poacher with a flashlight, but something didn't seem right. Shelley thought it was unnatural. Eric and Sean headed out into the field to further investigate. As they approached the woods, the lights went out. It was so quiet, even the snap of a tree branch underfoot echoed. Eric and Sean around his flashlight off, hoping to catch any potential poacher unaware. Eric felt something far beyond any fear he'd ever felt hunting. All Eric and Sean found was each other. Not even a track on the ground to possibly give them a hint of what they'd seen. Chelsea's boyfriend, Nathan, had came for a visit. They decided to go for a walk in the woods with the dogs. The dogs, which ran ahead of them, catching a scent. When Chelsea and Nathan both caught up, the dogs were rooting around by a large hole in the ground. Nathan thought the overly round hole had been dug with care. Chelsea had a bad feeling about the whole thing and urged him to leave. Finally, he agreed. What had the dogs found? It was Memorial Day weekend, and Shelley was making the evening coffee. The dogs did not want to go outside to their pen. Something wasn't right. Eric noticed that it was particularly quiet on that misty evening. When Eric had heard an odd sound off in the distance, he knew there was some sort of danger out there. Eric began to usher Shelley into the house. She protested, but when she heard some rustling in the distance, accompanied by 5 sets of eyes looking back at them, she too realized the danger. They rushed into the house, locking the door. Eric knew very well this wasn't a bear, but it was huge and very dangerous. The guns were in the barn, and Eric wasn't sure his family was safe in the house. Eric wanted to get the guns, but Shelley told him to stay. She went up to Chelsea's room and woke her daughter. Chelsea, who was half awake when she looked out the window, laid back down and went back to sleep. All 5 of the creatures were still there. One stood on its hind legs and looked right at Shelley. Eric felt an instinct to protect his family. With the creatures in the distance, he thought he might be able to get to the family car, backed up close enough to get them out. Even with his disability, Eric went outside. Shelley went through the house, closing the windows. She finally found the 2 hunting dogs hiding in a shadowed corner. If the dogs were scared, Shelley was concerned. When Eric reached the porch, he realized he might have had the distance to get there. It was going to be the longest 20 feet of his life. He began to slowly walk toward the car. When he finally reached it, grabbing the keys to try and unlock the door, the motion sensor lights popped on. Eric was frightened and very vulnerable. Suddenly, he was face to face with one of these creatures. It tried to reach into the light, but something had stopped it. It bolted off into the darkness. Eric made for the house as quickly as he could. They decided to call the police, hoping for somebody else to drive in while they remained sheltered. The police did not take them seriously, telling Shelley to close the windows and lock the doors. Nobody was coming. They were on their own. Shelley heard them approach. They were on the other side of the outside wall, and if they wanted in, they were going to get in. Her family was now being held hostage in their own house by these creatures. They weren't able to get the guns. There weren't any police coming. What were they going to do? Grabbing every sharp implement they could find, Shelley went and woke Chelsea. They needed all hands awake and alert. They all made their way into the master bedroom, lying on top of the bed, armed, waiting on daylight to come. When they heard the creatures outside, they were petrified. The only thing between the Martins and the creatures was the bedroom window. When morning came, they finally breathed a sigh of relief. The creatures who were now gone. Eric called Sean, who came over to help look for tracks. The tracks they did find were huge, enormous claws. They showed a creature who could walk on 2 feet. The creatures had been hunting, stalking. Were they werewolves? To this day, nobody truly knows. As a matter of fact, this show was told and dramatized by sci-fi's very own Paranormal Witness. Not a sighting, but hearing 2 very unusual howls in the woods behind my property. October 17th, shortly after midnight. A full moon too, so it was almost like your classical horror movie script. I live in the town of Portland, Maine. Lived in the Maine woods all my life. I am very well versed and familiar with the sounds of just about all local wildlife. It certainly was not coyotes. I hear them mostly every night. Not Bigfoot-like sounds either, as I looked them up on the internet. These were 2 short howls, about 20 seconds apart from one another. Very canine in nature, but deeper and louder, meaning big lungs. It was hard to determine the proximity. It could have been as far away as a half mile from my property, but it sounded nearby, nonetheless. I had a strong gut reaction to better go inside. While I have never felt threatened by any wildlife sounds before, just reporting this as a backup in case there would be reports of sightings here. I also like to report as a possible sighting that a friend had told me. In August of 2016, early evening, he was chased out of a farm in Lexington, not too far away from here. He is an avid hunter, and he described it as something way larger than a bear or a moose. He was alerted by his 2 Rottweilers in the back of his truck going in full panic mode. That's when he saw something huge, standing on 2 legs behind a tree, maybe 20 feet away in his rearview mirror. It then leapt on all 4s towards his truck. He started the truck, bolting out of there, seeing the thing chase him in the mirror for a short while. Don't think he reported it, as he still can't really accept what he saw. he doesn't like talking about it. I did not know about dogman back then when he told me. Just started researching after I heard the unusual howls that I'd heard a couple of days ago. I hope this is useful. My experience was not a visual encounter, but hearing unusual howls, unusual enough to start searching the internet. I have heard audio clips, and the gut feeling I got of being very, very uncomfortable and feeling like I need to go inside very quickly. I hear the coyotes out here almost every night. The howl was a one-time only, and I've never heard it since. The sighting in Lexington happened in 2016. It was actually by a friend of mine. He told me once, just after it happened, and he himself still cannot come to terms with what he saw. He would rather not speak about it. I never heard of dogman back then either, and it wasn't until I began thoroughly researching that I connected the dots and realized that was probably what he had seen and what I might have heard. Altogether, I thought I'd report this as a confirmation in case of other reports in the main area. In 2001, I'm a night owl. I always stay up late at night, watching TV. I just happened to look out my window one night and saw what I initially thought was a man sitting on a roof. I thought it was a man because at first he looked almost naked until I saw the hair or fur on him. He then turned his face, and what I saw then was frightening. He had pointed ears like a dog and a long snout. They were almost like German Shepherd ears. I could not understand what I was looking at. I stared at him for a few moments. I felt like if I moved, he would see me. It sat there on its butt, human-looking arms and legs, but with hair or fur covering them. I backed away from the window very slowly, went to tell my husband. He didn't want to go get up and look. He thought I was imagining it. I went back to the window, and it was gone. I don't know or understand what I saw that night, but I did tell my husband and kids what I saw. It was haunting me for many years until I was just telling a few of my grandchildren recently at camp. One of them had got on the computer and found some pictures of what they thought I meant. It was terrifying. I was looking at the same thing that I saw on the roof that night. I could not believe it. As I sit here looking at that picture, I did not know it really existed many, many years ago. An old friend and I crossed the path of a dogman in Chateauguay, a city situate in the province of Quebec, just at the south shore of Montreal. 1 week before our encounter, without knowing about it until after our own, the father of my friend encounter, the one in Leary, a town next to Chateauguay and connected to the natural park. The Chateauguay sighting happened during the summer of 2005. But for a very long time, I always believed it was 2008. I am bad at remembering exact dates. My friend, the second witness, have recently refreshed my memory about it. I am telling you because I have already filled a report a couple years ago, which can be found on this map, with the wrong year and some missing information that the father of my friend did not tell us at this point. The Chateauguay encounter. The creature had been following us all along the border of the forest and the entrance zone of the park, doing weird canine sounds, like it was upset or something. I'm not sure. We tried our best to keep calm, and heading to the car, which was at the fence directly at the entrance door of the natural park. At the moment we entered the car, my friend opened the light of the car, and my friend saw a 6-foot-tall dogman looking right at him at the other side of the fence, like 2 to 3 meters away from his car door. He only saw some of its facial features and the eye shines. It was enough to get afraid, like hell, move away from the car. I never managed to see the dogman directly, and the creature did not follow us after we departed. For the other sighting, which happened 1-ish weeks before our encounter, the father of my friend and the ex-boyfriend of the sister of my friend got out of their chalet one night after hearing weird commotion behind the chalet. By the way, the chalet is built at the very edge of a very large marsh, which connected to the natural park. when two of them arrived behind the chalet to find out what caused all the noise. Both of them saw a very large black dog, large shoulders, eating something in the brush, roughly 7 meters away. The creature turned, facing them rapidly, and began growling. The father followed up his instinct and grabbed a large stick near him and prepared himself for the worst. At this very moment, the creature stood up, making a very small step or two toward him, continuing to growl. The father was shocked from the scene, and his daughter's boyfriend became white like a ghost. A few seconds after, the dogman stepped aside very fast, returned on all fours, and ran a very short distance, jumping directly into the marsh, disappearing forever. My friend retreated to the chalet to join his father and his sister's boyfriend, only when the dogman had escaped. So for him at this time, it was only a very strange large dog. His father and the now ex-sister boyfriend never told my friend that the dog creature had stood up, until my friend had his own encounter 1 week later. Since then, we speculate that all of us have seen the same creature, maybe a member of the same pack, due to the forced connection between the natural park and his chalet. My friend's family never saw any dogmen again around there since the summer. We don't know if it was only passing by that sector, or if it's possibly living there, avoiding humans at all costs. I don't know any other eyewitnesses. Since it was summer break for my school, I was lazily lounging at home, just watching TV. I got bored, so I went outside to see if I could do anything with my chickens, like feed them worms and snails. Before I go into more detail, I should explain the area in which I live. My home is on the outskirts of the city that I live in. I had about 5 or 7 chickens at the time, and we had not expanded the coop. It was a small pen connecting the 2 sides of the chicken coop, which is wooden and sturdy. The only ways to get into the coop is either through the trap door, attached to the big door, and the 3 windows. One window is on one side of the door, and the second window is on the other side. The third window is a large window. Now, keep in mind they all have traps connected to them, so they can be closed. We have 7 acres of woodland. We refer to it as the back pasture. If you've ever been back there, you could see that it's a popular habitat for the local deer. There was also a wild boar that was roaming around at the time. I don't know how it got there. We had been having trouble with poachers for a while now, considering the population of deer in the woods. One poacher had set up a trail cam, one that was motion activated. There was an old rusty deer stand that had been put on a tree long ago. The tree had begun to grow around it. Beyond our acres of woods, there's also a large cornfield owned by our neighbors, and beyond that is a forest. I don't know what the forest is like beyond the field, since we've never been back there. I went outside to do something with my chickens, and I had brought along a bucket full of corn, feeding the deer. When I walked out of my home, I saw a doe was sitting in the tall grass. I thought it was sleeping, since it had its head down and was not moving. I, being the curious little nut that I was, decided I would sneak up on the deer and get a picture of it, showing it to my mother when she got home from work. I crept as silently as I could across the yard, separating me from the deer. I also should mention that we have a clearing with a burn pit in it, filled with cedar branches. I was creeping across my yard towards the deer, and when I'd cleared the burn pit and was about 10 yards from it, I realized the deer was not asleep. The deer was dead. It was the most disgusting sight I'd ever seen. Its intestines were completely gone, flesh on the body of the doe shredded to pieces, and blood everywhere. It looked as if it had been sitting there for a while. It smelt like it too. Most of the blood at this point was dried, and the air reeked with the stench of rotting flesh, urine, and what seemed like a hint of wet dog. Something that creeped me out was the scene. Although the carcass was rotting, there were no insects at all around it. It was as if the usual lively forest was more dead than the deer. Not even the neighbor's cattle made a sound. It looked as if the poor deer had simply been left after being brutally attacked and half-eaten, which it most likely was. I left the bucket at the beginning of the trail, thinking that I would come out later with my mother and grain the deer when she got home. Then, I began to walk back to my house. I had barely taken a few steps when I heard a low, snarling growl that sounded like a wolf. Although it seemed distorted, as if it were playing a part on an old radio. Sorry, that's the only way I can think of describing it. And against my better judgment, I turned my head around and saw what looked like the biggest flipping wolf I'd ever seen. It was on all fours. It was black, matted in some places. Its face was like what you'd expect a wolf to look like, although it was broad, and the muzzle seemed a little short. Although, the way it was curling its lips back made it look as if the snout was plenty long, and its eyes were yellow. Not a bright yellow, like the yellow of a flower or the sun, but a dim amber red yellow, if that makes sense. Its ears reminded me much more of a Doberman. You know, cropped ears. Its front legs were long, and it looked as if it were a bodybuilder. Its paws, if you can even call them paws, looked like huge hands with huge claws at the end of them. It stood up, and I heard the most sickening popping sound you could imagine. It sounded like the sound of popping joints, but it was amplified, as if being played through a microphone, and the sound was coming out of loudspeakers. Its body looked like a bodybuilder's pumped up on steroids. It was so big, I cannot overemphasize. It had no tail that I could tell, and it seemed to tower over me, although I was a good 10 meters from it. I was only about 5 foot 4 inches at the time, and I came nowhere close to its height. It was so tall that the tip of its ears could almost touch the top of a young cedar. It let out a loud howl, which sounded more like a roar, and charged. Doing the only thing I knew to do while hyped up on fear and adrenaline, I ran away. I remember clearing my yard in what seemed like hours, but was most likely only a few seconds, and running inside, slamming and locking all the doors and windows. As I calmed down a small bit, I realized that if it had really wanted to kill me, it would have. That what I had experienced was not an attack charge, but a bluff. I was lucky to get away with my life. Although this happened 2 years ago now, it still terrifies me to think about it. The deer was gone the next day, and ever since that evening, I have been very weary around the woods, only going in them in broad daylight. It's the only time I feel safe. Only when I absolutely had to, and never without a weapon. Sadly, I cannot say that I am one of those people that have stopped experiencing things after the encounter. Although I only had nightmares for a month after that day in June, nothing really started to happen again until about 2 months ago. I was staying up at night, playing on the laptop. I'd begin to hear things moving around on the porch, so I turned on the light to see the shape of something huge disappearing quickly behind the corner of my house. There was also one of the rare times I went into the woods after the first encounter. This is when I was helping my mother clear brush from the hunting clearing. I was going to go get the mower, and as I was walking the trail to do so, I heard bipedal footsteps following me off to my side. They stopped whenever I stopped, and I eventually ran out of the woods. I've not been back since. I had asked my late grandmother about the creature that I had seen. She informed me there was something called the wolfhead man that stalked the Kansa tribe, preying on small children that strayed too far from their teepees. Later, I was informed by my history teacher that my house, of course, had actually been built on a tribal burial ground. I have since been wondering if that had something to do with it. I hadn't heard about the wolfhead man before she had told me about it. When I saw there were several eyewitness reports that proved to be truthful, it made me feel a lot better about coming out with this information. I had attempted to tell people previous to the submission, but everybody either said I was stupid, crazy, or just a flat-out liar. One thing's for certain. I am not stupid. I am not crazy. And I am most definitely not a liar. I know what I saw, and what I saw was a dogman. Date of submission, June 8th, 2015. September 2020. This afternoon, about 5 p.m., I'd went to pick up my daughter from work. She works in Woonsocket, right near the high school. I parked in the lot, which is backed up to a little wooded-like area. I was reading Facebook on my phone while I waited. I had this feeling, though, of being watched that just sort of came over me. I began looking around and turned in my seat to look into the trees. I did this to see if I could see anything or anybody. And sure enough, I see this big dark figure just standing there, watching me. I turned back around in my seat, hoping it didn't realize I seen it, lifting my phone up enough just to film it in my rearview mirror. You can see it moving around. It even stands up taller for a bit before ducking back down. I needed to see if I could get a better look, because I was starting to second-guess myself and what I was seeing. As I opened my car door and stepped out, I moved to the back of my car and looked when I heard what sounded similar to a deep growl, and then bolted into the trees. It was so fast, though, I did not get a good look at it. The first sighting, 2007. My husband was on his way to work, right around 4 in the morning, on a rural road. While rounding an S-bend with his headlights, he hits a large dark brown figure that was sitting about 30 feet off the road, watching the road. He described the figure as about 4 feet tall, sitting with legs bent out in front of it. A wolf-like face, large pointed ears, does not remember eyeshine, leaning back on human-like arms. My husband immediately felt endangered, flooring his vehicle's accelerator. This man has no fear of humans. I've known him for 30 years, and have never seen him afraid of any natural being. He's hunted and fished since childhood. It took him a couple of years before he told me about this sighting. He said that his first thought was that this thing could catch his car, rip me out, and eat me if it wanted to. He was paranoid and had his head on a swivel all that day. And still, to this very day, he cannot drive past that location without feeling some kind of way. A second sighting occurred in 2010 and also happened to a coworker. I noticed she was acting strangely whenever anybody talked about spooky things. So, I'd asked her what's up. She said, "Okay, don't think I'm crazy." Then, she went on to tell me how one night, she was driving home from a late second shift, between midnight and 1 in the morning. About 5 or so miles from the first sighting occurred. She had to slow down near a stop, turning onto a road that would take her home. That's when she began to hear what sounded like running alongside her car. When she glanced out her driver's window, she saw the most horrible face. Her first thought was werewolf. She described it as being black and gray in color, with large teeth. She did not look again, but could hear it running next to her car until she reached about 50 miles an hour. That's no joke on a back road. She was scared out of her wits. After arriving home, she ran to the door, dropped the keys, went inside, closing all the curtains, and did not sleep a wink that night. We're both nurses. I've known her for about 7 years. She grew up in New York and is not a storyteller. Neither of these people like to talk about their sightings. You can see a change in them when their encounters are brought up. I don't need to see one to believe them. I know they exist.